Welcome back, builders. In today's video we're going to give you our first impressions of the Zeta Dawn version 2 from bicycleengines.com, as well as our final thoughts and opinions about the Phantom 85 in its current state. We'll be going over the full build in detail as it sits at the moment, but first let's go for a ride on a nice hot southern day. So let's go ahead and start off with our first impressions of the Zeta Dawn version 2 from bicycleengines.com, and then we'll move on to our thoughts about the Phantom 85 as it sits at the moment. Now you guys got a little sneak peek of both the motor and the bike in our last video, but this is going to go into more detail since I've had some time to ride the bike. The Zeta Dawn comes in at a sweet spot price of $4.99 at the time of recording, and had it not been for one major issue, this would have been a highly recommended bike for new builders or builders looking to upgrade to a more powerful engine. Still, for the price this bike comes in at, I'm pretty happy with it. These issues I've been able to overcome, but they might be deal breakers to some. So starting up front, now this bike is mostly stock, but we changed a few things up. I went ahead and added a left-hand side mirror. This is arguably just as important as a helmet in my opinion. For our clutch lever, of course, this Phantom kit came with the defective trigger lock, so we went ahead and did our modification to this. I'll leave a link in the description in case you're wondering. But this gives us more clutch travel and makes the stopper actually functional. Stock grips at the moment, and the bars on this is actually pretty decent. Now they might be identical to what comes on the Screaming Demon, I can't remember, and they're not perfect. I prefer the upright riding position. These are more aggressive. However, with the stem on this headset, they give you a little more length for reach, especially if you're a taller individual like me. The brake levers that come with this bike are pretty decent. I found that I didn't need to use a dual brake lever simply because they're low profile and they sit next to each other really well. And this having mechanical disc brakes means that you don't need to apply a whole lot of pressure to get good stopping power on the bike. So I'm happy with these ones and I'll probably just leave them the way they are. The fork that comes with this bike is up for controversy. Some of my Discord members claim it has a lot of flex under heavy braking. Others say that it's a bit stiff when it comes to suspension. Personally, I haven't noticed either of these being an issue for the way I ride. I don't push my bike to the limits. But I will say that the stanchions are a little bit thinner than the forks that come on the F-Zero from Bikeberry. However, I trust this fork quite a bit more than the one that comes on the Screamin' Demon. So I will say that these are better than the absolute cheapest suspension forks you can get, but definitely an area you'd want to consider upgrading if you plan on pushing this bike hard. The tires that come on this bike I'm actually quite pleased with. The tread feels pretty thick and the sidewalls don't feel paper thin. I won't say they're anything special, but the rubber compound feels like it's going to stand up to the abuse of the motor for quite some time. Now on to the wheel set, and the major issue I had with this bike, also confirmed with 3 other Discord members who had the same issue. You may notice, if you have a keen eye, that I'm currently running the stock wheels from my F-Zero on the bike. Well, that's because the stock wheels that came with the Zeta Dawn were not only dangerous, but just unusable. They had so much flex because nearly every single spoke on the front and back wheel was loose that the rear wheel was running into the chainstay and the front wheel was bending into the forks. Somebody dropped the ball at the factory and they just put the spokes on the bike but did not tension them whatsoever. Now I can true a wheel when it has a little bit of wobble, but I don't have enough experience to deal with it when every single spoke is loose. I tried, and the wheel had so much run out that the ride became very bumpy. So I'll have to take the stock wheels to a shop to get trued by a professional before I can use them on a bike. We'll run the F-Zeros for now. I note also that the spokes are a little thin on the Zeta Dawn. However, I find them to be adequate for a stock or lightly modified China doll. However, I wouldn't use it for a more powerful motor like the Phantom 85. And that brings us to why it's not really a deal breaker to me or experienced builders, because if you're going to put a powerful motor on this bike, you're probably going to be upgrading the wheel set anyways. But for new builders, it's definitely an issue. Here I'd like to give a shout out to Vanilla from our Discord server, who gave me the idea to drill through the hub and use 6mm bolts to replace the thinner 5mm bolts which hold on the sprocket and rotor. When you apply a lot of torque to these rear wheels, those thinner bolts have been known to pull out quite often, something I've dealt with in the past. So far this is holding on strong, but I'll need more time to test it before I make any claims that it's a good idea. So if you try it, do it at your own risk. I've been keeping a good eye on it, and so far they've been holding on strong. Just like with the F-Zero, I drilled a small hole in the cap so the tank would vent and added a gasket to prevent gas from leaking around the rim. Under vibration, gas does still leak through the vent, so I might try to add some kind of a check valve to keep gas from leaking on the side of the tank and staining the paint. With this white paint job, you notice any imperfections a lot more than you would on the black one. Unfortunately, the muffler that comes with the Phantom 85 looks good and sounds great. The welds are a bit thin, and I had to re-weld the muffler onto the pipe as well as the pipe onto the header. I did a crappy job and need to redo it, but hopefully it'll hold on long enough for them to come out with that expansion chamber they promised. Now for a while I was running the PWK21 carb with the G2 reed on this motor, and I will admit the power increase was significant, especially on the top end, and it had really good throttle response. Unfortunately, with the G2 reed, just like on my hybrid, it had the exact same idle issue, where it just wouldn't idle. Eventually, after the motor heated up, it didn't matter what I did with the jets, the paddles would never seal properly, giving too much volume to this thing. I'm not sure why, but the G2 reed is such a pain to work with, so I went back to the OZ and the stock carburetor, and now this bike runs good and idles perfect. I sacrificed some top-end performance, but I'm not trying to squeeze every last ounce of power out of the Phantom 85 simply because even with the stock carburetor and reed, this thing has incredible power. Another thing about the wheels that I didn't mention, but I'm bringing it up now because it was the same for the pedals, is the bearings were really tight out of the box. I had to readjust the pedal and wheel bearings so they wouldn't chew themselves to death. And lastly, I went ahead and upgraded the crank and chainring on this bike to what it should have come with in the first place. I don't know why these gas bike frames insist on using oversized chain rings when smaller ones are better for so many reasons. First, it's easier to pedal from a dead stop, and since you don't do a lot of pedaling, that's a no-brainer. And second, which is really more important in my opinion, is it allows you to flush mount the motor. Because the bend in the frame is specifically designed for these bottom ends, it allows you to flush mount without pinching the frame on both the front and rear motor mount. It also lowers the motor's center of gravity, making it more maneuverable if you plan on putting it on a track. And you don't have to use some funky universal or CNC adapter to fit the motor to the bike. Also, while installing this, I went ahead and put in a chain tensioner for the pedal side so I could avoid using one on the drive side. And because this bike has horizontal dropouts, that makes chain tension adjustments really simple. And also note that on the rear dropouts, I added large washers on the in and outside of the dropouts to prevent the bolts from chewing into the aluminum frame. This is something they should have come with and didn't. Now, most of the issues I covered in this video are not something that you're only going to find on this bike. A lot of them were similar to what came on the F-Zero. The only major difference being that the wheel set on this bike was unusable out of the box. Other than that, for the price, I say this bike is worth it if you're an experienced builder and you plan on dealing with the wheel set. The items that come with this bike for that price are decent and usable. However, you're going to be upgrading a few things if you plan on putting a beefy motor on this bike. So just keep that in mind. And with all that being said, overall I'm happy with the Zeta Dawn. On paper, it's exactly what I wanted one of these gas bike frames to be, except for the chainring being too big, and obviously the wheels being defective, but that was not intentional. They gave you spoked wheels, knowing that's what the majority of riders wanted, as the mag wheels were something that needed to be done away with. Going back to an on-paper design, as far as I can tell for this price point, the Zeta Dawn is just about as good as you're going to get for a motor-ready bicycle, unless you plan on spending a lot more money. There are little improvements that I think would make this perfect, such as having the thicker bolts already installed on the rear hub, and having a smaller chainring, and that's just assuming the rest of the bike doesn't have defective parts. So, I'm happy with this. Let's go ahead and give our official review of the Phantom 85. Now we have the Gen 2 that's been upgraded with a balanced and trued crank as well as a needle bearing from DLH Performance. As far as I know, all of the current models of the Phantom 85 come with needle bearings as they've done away with the bushings. Now, unfortunately, I don't have high hopes for the Phantom 85 lasting very long. I've seen so many issues from other builders, including on their newest generations with the needle bearings, that these motors just don't seem to be holding up as they should. It's been such a bumpy ride for this motor as is, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better. but I'm only going to give you the review from my perspective with the motor that I have. Before we get into how well my motor's been holding up, I would like to point out that an anonymous source reached out to me who claims to be the designer of the Phantom 85 top end, or more appropriately, the person who adapted the chainsaw jug to a YD100. And he would like to clear the air about two very important things that they did not follow in his original design. First, as most of us know, they cut costs by putting a bushing when it was supposed to have a needle bearing. And second, they made his intake port much wider than it was supposed to be, which is apparently causing ring snagging issues for a lot of builders. He wanted to clear that up and let you know that he's working with them to try and get them to redesign the jug for a two-piece top end and a better intake port. So on to my motor. Recently, if you saw our last video, you would have noticed that as we were taking it apart to install the balanced and true DLH crank, we noticed some gouging and scuffs in our jug and on the piston. I'm not sure what could have caused this. I suspect it's an overheating issue because this motor does not have very good cooling, especially since it was designed to be, well, based off a chainsaw jug, which has forced air cooling, a lot like the issues you run in on Minarellis with the stock heads. Unfortunately, this being a single-piece jug, you can't really do much to cool it off, except go faster with a smaller rear sprocket. We're running a 36 on ours, and that's my comfort level. I don't plan on going any smaller, but it might be a good idea for some builders to use a smaller sprocket, for two reasons. One, to get the engine to run cooler. It has plenty of power, so it won't be struggling. And two, to get the engine to run smoother. As most of you know, you can't really cruise very well on a Phantom 85 unless you retard the heck out of the timing and add an aftermarket carburetor. And with that being said, when I put the motor back together, it still had fantastic compression, so the gouging doesn't seem to have affected performance yet. I just suspect this motor probably won't last very long with us. Putting the stock carburetor back on it, I went through the jets and I found that the 72 jet for me to be the sweet spot. In the video I was running a 70 and that was a little too lean on the top end, but if I go smaller it's really rough in the mid-range. I'm going to try and mess with the needles on the carburetor, see if I can find one that's a little bit thicker so I can run a fatter jet for the top end and get a little leaner in the mid-range. Yeah, I don't know if that'll help, but it's worth a shot. In my opinion, the Phantom 85 is just not really a practical motor. It's got too many issues, its road has been way too bumpy along the way, and the only thing it has going for it is that it's really powerful. In my opinion, it's got the most low and mid-range power out of any stock motor you can put on a bike, with the exception possibly being the Southern Customs new hybrid, which recently came out. Having a powerful motor is great and it's a lot of fun, but I tend to base my reviews off how I feel a motor can handle a long-range trip. And when I take the Phantom 85 out and it gets hot, it does start to act a bit funny, and it's not something I trust for a long-range trip. Let me know in the comments how yours has been holding up, whether you've had a lot of issues or whether it's been flawless and you've been able to take it out for nice long rides. That's pretty much all I have to say about it for now. I'll probably revisit the Phantom 85 if they ever have a significant revamp on this jug, but until then, I'm not sure it's something I'm going to mess with. Obviously, if they come out with that pipe they've been promising, I will definitely test it, and that's pretty much all we got to go for. So I hope you guys got some useful information out of today's video, or at the very least, were mildly entertained. And until next time, ride safe.